When only 2 people are in the room when a gun goes off, only 2 people can tell us what happened. But when one of them is dead and the police don't believe the survivor, it's up to the evidence to tell the truth. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. I am back from CrimeCon UK, and I wanted to announce my next event, which is the True Crime Podcast Festival in Austin, Texas, August 25th through the 27th. On the 26th, which is the Saturday, you can catch me and Josh Hallmark discussing how his team rules in and out Israel Keys' possible victims. And then you'll also get to hear me and Eric, my co-host from Crime Lines and Consequences, talk about famed psychic Sylvia Brown and what happened when she dipped her toe into missing persons cases. Ticket info is in the show notes, so let's go ahead and get into today's case, which takes place in Michigan. The major sources were a book called A Deadly Affair by Tom Henderson and the reporting of the Detroit Free Press. I also want to thank Haley Gray for some background research she provided. Let's get started with Leann Meisner, who was one of 5 children. She was the youngest with 1 older brother and 3 older sisters. In spite of the age gap between her and her siblings, she was close to them. Having older siblings several years older than her meant that Leann was used to having lots of sets of hands to guide her as she grew up. She was, admittedly by her family, a little spoiled, but in a supportive, loving way. She was a dynamic personality and quick with a joke. She grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, and when she graduated from high school, she wasn't looking at going to college. Leann preferred going straight to work, and she first got a job as a telemarketer and later as a sales rep for a dental company. In 1990, when Leann was 20, she went to a Halloween party at Michigan State University with a friend. She dressed up in her costume, which was a devil, and was approached by an undergrad student named Michael Fletcher, who went by Mick. Mick opened with a line that I am sure is going to get some eye rolls. With Leann dressed as a devil, his pickup line was, "If you're the devil, then take me to hell." The line worked, mostly because Mick was charming and good-looking, and the two began dating. In September of 1993, a year after Mick finished his undergrad degree, the two married after 3 years of dating. They were both 23 at the time. They had already bought a small home in Hazel Park shortly before their marriage, and Mick was in law school. Both Leann and Mick worked while he was in school, with Mick working at Radio Shack during the day and taking classes at night, and Leann studied to become a nail tech. 3 years into their marriage, they had a daughter, and Leann started working part-time at the salon so that she could juggle motherhood and still make an income to help make ends meet. Thanks to willing grandparents who were always happy for time with their granddaughter and weekend hours when Mick would be home, they made it work. In 1997, Mick graduated, which meant instead of work in school, he just had work. But getting a new career off the ground, particularly as an attorney, didn't exactly make him less busy. After clerking for a local prosecutor's office, Mick went into private practice as a defense attorney. As far as balancing family life, different people have different perceptions of Mick's abilities. He did become a bit distanced towards Leann, which some chalked up to the time and stress his new law practice demanded of him. And others thought Mick believed he was better than Leann now that he was an attorney and she was a nail tech. According to what one friend told the Detroit Free Press, Leann once found a credit card application Mick had filled out. Instead of her actual occupation, he wrote consultant. Leann was confused and she asked her friend why would Mick have done that? And the friend's guess was that he was ashamed of her actual occupation. Now, I'm not sure that's the conclusion I would draw because a credit card company isn't really someone you try to impress because you have to provide accurate income amounts regardless of the job title. I mean, if Mick was introducing Leann to friends as a consultant, then I would see it. But impressing the faceless data entry person at the credit card company doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I'll admit, I can't think of any other reason why he would write the wrong occupation down for Leann. Now, Mick's family has denied that he was ever ashamed of Leann and that he was actually quite proud to be her husband. As for Leann, she did have some complaints about how Mick didn't make enough time for her, and on the Saturdays she would go to work and Mick would stay home. She would come home to Mick on the couch watching TV, no housework would have been done, and their daughter would still be in her pajamas. Some of Leann's family didn't think Mick was all that interested in fatherhood, though others have said he was pretty involved reading to his daughter and making sure that the videos she was watching were sufficiently educational. By all reports, she was a very bright toddler with an expansive vocabulary thanks to Leann and Mick exposing her educationally to quality material. Regardless of other people's interpretations of what was going on in the marriage, Leann did have issues with the long hours Mick spent outside the house, and not all of that time was directly related to work. Sometimes there were networking and social events with other young attorneys. He told Leann that no one else took their spouses, so she would stay home. Leann started suspecting, eventually, that there was something else keeping Mick away from home. She thought he may be cheating. It started in 1997 when Mick was spending a lot of time with a judge named Don Grunberg, who was sort of a mentor to him. When Mick had a party after passing the bar, he gave a short speech in which he thanked Don, but he didn't mention Leann or their daughter at all. And this really upset Leann, given her suspicions that the two were too close. It was enough that Leann once drove past Don's home when Mick was, quote, working late to look for his car, but it wasn't there. So Leann was pretty happy when, around May of 1998, Mick was complaining about Don, saying that she had been making negative comments about some work he had been doing for another judge. He said it was so bad that he decided to stop working with Don entirely. Given Leann's suspicions, she was happy at this break, but it wasn't long before another issue came up. The other judge Mick was working with was also a woman, and Leann soon enough suspected that Mick might be cheating with her. Leann confronted him about it, but he did deny it. She and a friend drove by that judge's house to see if Mick's vehicle was out there, but it never was. At this point, the stress was wearing on both of them, and they were arguing a lot. So in June of 1998, Mick moved out for a few weeks. He came back home but told a friend of Leann's that he was only back for the sake of their daughter. In October 1998, Mick left again for a week, came back, left again, and then was back home by Christmas. The back and forth was very hard for Leann, who loved her husband and did not want a divorce. But she couldn't shake the feeling that when he would leave, it was because he was seeing another woman. At a New Year's Eve party shortly after Mick had moved back home, he got a page around midnight. Not long after, he told Leann that he had a headache and was going to head home, but she could stay and just have fun at the party. Suspecting Mick might be trying to sneak off to see someone else, Leann said she'd go home with him, and the two left. A couple of weeks later, Mick left again, and this time he filed for divorce. Leann still did not want a divorce, even though this was the fourth time in 7 months that Mick initiated a separation. She wanted to repair the relationship, not just have Mick back home with no changes made. She wanted the relationship to actually be better, which meant Mick being more dialed in at home with both her and their daughter. And she didn't want to have to worry that he was cheating on her. Mick had left before, but never for long, and never had he filed for divorce. So as the weeks dragged on and Mick wasn't coming home, Leann started preparing for the divorce. She borrowed money from her parents to retain a divorce attorney, and she told her lawyer that she was mostly focused on making sure her daughter was taken care of. It wasn't long after Leann had told people she accepted the divorce was inevitable that Mick started having second thoughts. In late March, 2 months after filing for divorce, he reached out to Leann to reconcile. She wasn't so sure about it, but he started sending her flowers. He cried about how much he wanted to be back together with her, and he promised that things would be different and he would be doing what he should have been doing all along. Though everyone around her, including her attorney, advised her against it, Leann took Mick back and he moved home in early April. And this time really was different than the other times they had gotten back together after a separation. Mick was more attentive and loving towards Leann. They started going out together more, and while Mick still had to work frequently, Leann didn't see the signs that she saw before when she suspected he was cheating, though he continued to deny having ever cheated on her. Things were going really well, though Mick never dropped the divorce case. It was still out there, though inactive. On August 12th, Leann called her divorce attorney, but he was out of town on vacation. She left a message for him to call her back, and it's unknown why she called him. On Friday, August 13th, the next day, Leann took a home pregnancy test, and it came back positive. She was thrilled, and she told Mick, who was also happy, and he made a comment about hoping for a boy this time. Now, Leann didn't take this comment too well, and Mick felt badly that she had taken the hope for a boy in a way he hadn't necessarily intended. So Mick bought Leann a sappy card to try to smooth things over and wrote inside, quote, "I might not always tell you, but you mean the world to me. I love you so much, sweetheart, and girl or boy, so long as they are a part of you, our children will all be beautiful. I love you." End quote. The next day, Leann and Mick started telling family about their news, who were just as happy as they were, and Leann's parents said they should celebrate on Sunday by going to church together and then going out to a nice dinner. Just 8 months before, the couple was on the verge of divorce, and it seemed amazing the progress they had made since then. With another baby on the way, there was a lot to celebrate. After the Sunday celebratory dinner, they all went back to Leann's parents' house for a little while. As they were leaving, Mick asked Leann's parents if they could babysit the next day because he wanted to take Leann out on a little lunchtime date. They said sure, though they did think it was an odd request. For one thing, it came from Mick. Their granddaughter was nearly 4 years old, and Mick had never arranged the babysitting. It was always Leann making the plans. But also the planned date sounded strange to them. Mick wanted to take Leann out to a gun range to shoot, which wasn't something they had ever done before because Leann was afraid of guns. Like, afraid. But even thinking this all sounded strange, they agreed to babysit. When Mick and Leann got home that night with their daughter, Mick said he had something at the office he had to finish up before a pretrial hearing he had in the morning, so Leann went in with their daughter and got her ready for bed. The next morning, Monday, August 16th, Mick went to work for the pretrial hearing and was home around 10:30. They got ready to go to the shooting range and then took their daughter to Leann's parents' house around 11:50. Leann told her parents that they would be back in about an hour. After the date, Mick had to go back to work, and Leann was going to take her daughter to the park with her sister. Before they left, Leann's mom, Gloria, asked why they were going to the range. Leann said that Mick had wanted her to learn to use the gun in case she ever needed it. He had bought it about a year before when he was working a drug case, and he was worried about his personal safety. Gloria half-jokingly asked if Mick had taken out a life insurance policy on Leann recently, and Leann laughed it off, saying that it wasn't like Mick was going to shoot her. Leann and Mick then drove a couple of miles to the gun range. At the range, witnesses saw the two and described Leann as very nervous around the gun. The two shot for a little bit, but it seems like Leann may have only fired the gun once herself. This gun was a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson, so I am not surprised that she only fired it once. The recoil is pretty strong, and if you're afraid of guns, the noise, the recoil, the whole experience would not be pleasant. So they didn't stay at the range for very long. It was around 12:15 when they left, and they realized they still had some time before having to pick up their daughter. So they decided to go home and take advantage of the kid-free time and have sex. The drive to their home was about 15 minutes, so they would have been arriving around 12:30 p.m. 18 minutes later, at 12:48, Mick called 911. He was hysterical. The dispatcher had to tell him to calm down just to be understandable. He said his wife had shot herself and he gave their address. The dispatcher asked if she was breathing, and Mick asked if he should roll her over to see, and the dispatcher said okay. Mick was also asked if anyone else was in the house, and he said no, he was alone with his wife, and their daughter was at his in-laws' house. He asked if he should put the safety on the gun, and he was told not to touch it or anything else, and the police would secure it when they got there. Mick then asked what he should do, and he was told to calm down and wait for the police. If Leann wasn't breathing, he should just go ahead and step out of the room. Mick then mentioned that she was half naked because they were going to, and then he trailed off, probably because he was about to say have sex, but his real concern in that moment was that she was uncovered. He asked if he should cover her up, and the dispatcher again said, don't touch anything. On the 911 call, you can hear the police enter and tell Mick to leave the house. They made it there in about 4 minutes. The first responders found 29-year-old Leann Fletcher on the floor of the bedroom with the gun nearby, and she was dead. Mick insisted that Leann had shot herself, but she was not suicidal. It had to have been an accident. The investigators took Mick to the station to question him, and he was very upset. They had to wait until he calmed down enough to talk. Because they didn't just want the broad story that the 911 dispatcher got. They wanted the specifics, step-by-step details. So Mick told them that he and Leann had come back from the gun range, and Leann carried in the gun case, and Mick carried the target and the ammo bag. Leann then put the gun case on the bed and went to the bathroom down the hall. Mick stayed in the bedroom where he loaded the clip and chambered a round. I'm saying he loaded the clip because that's what Mick kept saying. But I think he meant magazine because that's the word the police used. And the police are a little bit more trained in guns than the everyday Joe. I think Mick was just mixing up the words, which is not an uncommon mistake. After loading the first magazine, Mick picked up a second one and began to load that as well. He had 2 to 3 bullets in the magazine when Leann came back from the bathroom. Seeing as they intended on having sex, she was not fully dressed. Mick asked Leann if she could finish loading the magazine while he went to the bathroom. Mick then went into the bathroom, washed his hands, and got as far as undoing his belt when he heard a gunshot. He assumed Leann had been handling the gun when it discharged, and he would walk into the room and there would be a hole in the wall or in the ceiling. So he didn't exactly sprint into the room since he didn't think there was any real emergency. But when he got in there, he saw Leann was on the floor with blood on the bed and the floor around her head. Mick said he grabbed the phone immediately and called 911. The investigators were suspicious of Mick's story, but it was more their gut feeling at first than any evidence. Things like how they thought it was odd that Mick asked Leann, who shot a gun for the first time ever, to load a magazine. The gun was only a year old and it wasn't used a ton, so I imagine the spring was probably pretty tight, and it wouldn't have been the easiest thing to load for a first-timer. One of the police reports said Mick mentioned that he was having trouble loading the magazine, making it doubly unlikely that he would have asked Leann to do it. But that only appears in the one report and not in the others, so it's possible that he didn't say that, and the police officer writing it down had either misunderstood or misremembered what was said. The police noticed other things that seemed odd to them, like how there was no blood on Mick's cell phone, meaning he didn't have blood on his hands when he called, which meant he hadn't touched Leann prior to calling 911. They found it unusual for a victim's husband to have not tried to comfort her, render first aid, or even check for a pulse, which would have left blood on his hand. But that wasn't all that caught their attention. They also noticed there was blood under the gun and under the magazine, which had fallen to the ground when Leann was shot. If Leann shot herself and dropped these items, wouldn't they have made it to the floor before the blood? This made the police wonder if the scene was staged. But that was an assumption that defied physics. The force pulling the gun and the magazine to the floor was gravity. If the blood coming from Leann's wound was being acted upon by a force greater than gravity, like, let's say, the impact of a bullet, the blood would reach the ground first and be under the other items. The investigators were, on this point, analyzing the evidence beyond their own understanding, and I was surprised to hear later interviews where this was still a point for them, even after experts have debunked it. The police were also not impressed with Mick's attitude during the questioning. They felt like he was turning his emotions on and off, which was a judgment they made based on their experience as investigators. But gut feelings are not probable cause, and since they had no hard evidence just yet to contradict Mick's story, he was released after questioning. The police then executed a search warrant to search the family home around 4 p.m. on the day of Leann's death. We've talked about this before, but I never want to assume that you all hang on my every word or listen to every episode, so I do want to mention this again. This is something that cop shows skip over 99.9% of the time, and it's always important to know our rights. The Fletcher home was a crime scene, so everything in plain sight seen while responding to the 911 call was fair game. But if they wanted to really search the house and look in other rooms, look in drawers, open file cabinets, etc., they needed a warrant. They couldn't go rifling around just because this was a crime scene. I hope no one listening ever tragically has their home become a crime scene, but do know that you still have your constitutional rights regarding search and seizure, even in the event that happened. The focus of the first search the police did was forensic, because that evidence can degrade quickly. They checked the drain traps in the sinks in the house, and in the bathroom sink, they found blood. This told them that someone had washed their bloody hands in the sink. It wasn't Leann, and if it was Mick, he had failed to mention it to the police. The next morning, they went back to the house for a more thorough search of the contents. The most interesting items were found in Mick's home office, which was located upstairs in his spare bedroom. The room was a mess, so it took a little while to really go through things. First, they found the divorce complaint Mick had filed, which they learned he had never actually had dismissed. To the police, it seemed like he was still keeping his options open in spite of reconciling with Leann. Then they found an invoice for a computer. The shipping address was Mick's house, but the name on the invoice was Susan Charnowski, and they knew that name. She was a judge in Warren who had previously been a prosecutor in Oakland County. They assumed that the computer was work-related until they searched the closet of the office. In there, they found an accordion folder full of evidence that Leann was 100% right when she suspected Mick had been cheating on her. They found 3 photos. 2 were of Susan, the judge, and they also found cards and love letters. When they later pulled up emails, they found ones between Susan and Mick, making it clear they had an intimate relationship. On Tuesday, August 17th, the investigators went to Susan at her home to question her. It's not clear if they were giving her the courtesy of a visit at home versus work, or if it was just where they happened to find her. She had been at work earlier in the day, but left upset after someone had told her that Leann had taken her own life. Susan admitted to the police that she had a relationship with Mick, but said it was short-lived, starting in February 1999, while he was separated from Leann, and it ended the following month when he went back to his wife. It was more of a fling during a marital separation than a full-blown affair. The investigators asked where Susan was the day before when Leann was killed, and she said she was in Cedar Point, Ohio with family and didn't get home until 1 a.m., which is an alibi that checked out. They asked Susan if she and Mick had spoken since Leann's death, and she said no. He had paged her at about 7:30 while she was still in Ohio and did leave a message that something terrible had happened, instructing her to call his lawyer. But she said that she didn't call him back or speak with him. This struck investigators as strange because if the relationship only lasted a short time and it had been over for 4 months, why was Mick calling her the same day his wife died? But the investigators could see that Susan was very upset and they ended the interview. The investigators then spoke with one of Leann's friends who let them know that Leann suspected Mick had cheated on her before Susan with another judge named Dawn Grunberg. The friend told the police that Dawn tried to meet with Leann at one point, but Leann refused to see her. So the police went to speak with Dawn, who admitted that again, Leann was 100% right. Mick had cheated on her. This was a short-lived sexual relationship that lasted from September to November 1997. She said it was not an emotionally intimate relationship, it was just sexual, and it ended when she realized that Mick was, according to her, a user. She did confirm that she attempted to arrange a meeting with Leann to let Leann know what her husband had been getting up to. Then on Thursday, August 19th, 2 days after the police first talked to Susan, they spoke with her again after she reached out. She had sought legal advice and was ready to come clean with everything. She said that she was in shock during the first interview and really didn't know what to say, and then she apologized for having lied to the police. She then backed up and told the full story of the affair, or at least a version of it. Susan and Mick had met in 1997 when he became a research clerk for the court. He wasn't assigned specifically to her, but rather to a group of 4 judges. Susan was married at the time, and she heard around the court that Mick was good with electronics, having worked at Radio Shack for years. She needed some computers and other things wired up at her house, so she hired him for the job, and he was glad to take it. He could always use the extra money to support his family. And it was through him coming over to her house that she really got to know him. After Mick went into private practice, Susan would occasionally see him in her court as the defense attorney. And she would sometimes even assign him cases when she would have an indigent defendant in her court. In Michigan, they do have a public defender's office for clients who cannot afford an attorney, but they use a bit of a hybrid system where there are also contract attorneys and private attorneys who are open to taking these cases. They get paid from the state, and while it's not as much as a wealthy client would pay you, these cases are often the bread and butter for criminal defense attorneys who are just getting started. These were mostly misdemeanors and lower-level crimes. According to Susan, their relationship was emotional, but not sexual until July 1998, though investigators did find emails from months before that date that showed the two had, at the very least, emotional intimacy earlier than this, but they suspected more. By the time they were sexually intimate, according to Susan, she and her husband had separated pending their divorce. But she knew Mick was still married when they slept together for the first time, and she knew that he was highly unlikely to leave Leann. He believed his responsibility was to his wife and child first, so a divorce wasn't going to happen. Mick said he always told her this, but Susan said Mick changed his mind on the idea of a divorce as the affair continued. This was the start of Mick moving in and out of the home in the latter half of 1998. Susan told the police that she understood that Mick might stay with Leann for the sake of their daughter, but she wanted to know that that was all there was to it. She asked Mick straight out if he and Leann were still having sex in their marital relationship. Susan made it clear that she would not sleep with him if he was also still physically intimate with his wife. That was her line in the sand. And Mick assured her that they were not intimate. Basically, they lived as roommates who were raising a child together. After Mick left Leann in January of 1999 and filed for divorce, he and Susan had no barriers to their relationship. Things were going well as far as Susan could tell for about 2 months when Mick told her that he was going back to his wife. He told Susan that he wanted to repair his marriage, and that would mean no longer cheating. He intended to be the husband he should have been all along to see if that made a difference in their relationship. Susan believed he was sincere in his desire to fix things with Leann, and especially since there was a child involved, she let it go. Mick went back home around Easter of 1999 when he convinced Leann to take him back. Then, in June, Susan called Mick when she needed emotional support for a situation in her personal life, and that rekindled whatever they had between them, and soon they were back together with Mick confiding in her that the reconciliation did not work. He didn't see long-term that things were going to work out with Leann, because even when he felt he was doing everything right, they didn't have the deep love he thought two people should have. And I am sitting here absolutely flabbergasted that this man thought that if he stopped cheating on his wife for 2 whole months, that would somehow repair things. When they got back together, Susan was told by Mick that he and Leann were not having sex still. She even asked him directly, and he said, according to Susan, that if she could be a fly on the wall in their house, she wouldn't even have to ask that question. This clearly told Susan that Mick was only staying with Leann for the sake of their daughter, but we know that this was a lie since Leann got pregnant. Susan told the investigators that she had been seeing Mick right up to Leann's death. In fact, after the celebratory dinner Mick went to with family on August 15th, you know, that one where they were celebrating the new baby, he called Susan and told her he had an hour free. He then told Leann that he was going to the office, but he instead drove to Susan's house and they had sex. And no, he did not tell her that Leann was pregnant. She learned that only when the police told her. And though Susan initially told the police otherwise, she had actually spoken to Mick after Leann's death. The police learned about this through phone records, but Susan admitted that Mick called her after Leann's death, leaving that message about calling his attorney. She did call him back after 1 a.m. when she was back in town, left him a message, and then he called her back about a half an hour later. He said that he couldn't talk right then, but just that something horrible had happened. She didn't learn what that was until she went to work in the morning and someone told her Leann had shot herself. To the police, what Susan presented was a motive. Mick was doing okay juggling his wife and his girlfriend under the pretense that they didn't know about each other. Well, I mean, Susan knew about Leann but didn't know they were having sex. But then Leann got pregnant. Rather than being excited about the new baby, Mick was in a tight spot. Susan, the woman he was really in love with, made it clear she wouldn't be with him if he was sleeping with anyone else, which included his wife. It would be hard to convince her that they weren't intimate now that Leann had a baby on the way. And if Mick was torn about divorcing Leann before the pregnancy, he certainly couldn't see walking out on her while she was pregnant. The police theorized that Mick could only save his relationship with Susan and avoid the stress of a divorce if Leann was dead. It was a motive, but they needed evidence, which they got when the autopsy results came in. The ME concluded that Leann did not shoot herself. She physically could not have done it. Based on the stippling pattern, the gun had to have been shot from 12 to 18 inches away. The bullet had entered through Leann's right ear and traveled in a straight horizontal line. It was physically, based on the length of Leann's arms, impossible for her to hold a gun that far out, perfectly level and to the side, and pull the trigger. The ME ruled the death a homicide. Additionally, a forensic examination showed that there was microscopic high-velocity blood mist on the cuff of Mick's right sleeve. Blood would not have been traveling through the air at high velocity seconds after Leann had shot herself when Mick got into the bedroom, according to his story. He would have actually had to have been within 1 to 2 feet of Leann when the shot was fired for the blood mist to end up on his clothing. There is a lot of reporting, contradictory reporting, about blood on Leann's hands and what it told investigators. Whether it was or was not on her hands, where on her hands it might have been, and so on. But the issue here is that when they transported Leann's body from the scene, her hands were not bagged. Any evidence documented at the autopsy from her hands, including blood evidence, is irrelevant due to possible and, let's be frank, likely contamination. On August 19th, 29-year-old Mick Fletcher was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, assault of a pregnant individual with the intent of causing a miscarriage or stillbirth, and 2 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Less than a month later, in September of 1999, a prosecutor filed a formal complaint against Judge Susan Charnowski with the Judicial Tenure Commission to look into her handling of cases involving Mick Fletcher as the defense attorney, as well as Susan's initial statements to the police during the investigation into Leann's murder. From the time the affair started until Mick's arrest, which was about 13 to 17 months depending on which timeline you believe, Susan assigned to Mick 60 to 80 cases. The exact number's been inconsistently reported. But it was about 3 times as many cases as any of the other judges gave him, and that gave him a leg up in getting his practice started. In all, he earned about $16,000 from those cases, and they were mostly misdemeanors that usually pleaded out, so it wasn't a lot of work for the money. There is nothing saying a judge cannot give cases to someone they have a private relationship with, but usually if it's an intimate relationship and not just a casual friendship, they would avoid it, and it would be unethical for them to then preside over those cases and not disclose this clear conflict of interest. And this has happened in other cases. In 2010, the death sentence of Charles Dean Hood was overturned after 20 years when it came out that the DA and the judge had an undisclosed sexual relationship around the time of the trial. In 2021, an Oklahoma judge resigned after admitting to a sexual relationship with a prosecutor. Now, she characterized it as abuse, and there were appeals stemming from the cases he oversaw. In the majority of the cases involving both Susan and Mick, Susan accepted guilty pleas from his clients. But in one case, she dismissed the charges against the client, and that case was especially analyzed. In the end, it was determined that the rulings she made were fair and did not show undue bias towards Mick's side. However, even if she was fair in her rulings, that doesn't mean she gets to just skate by without consequence. Whenever I hear about a secret relationship like this, all I can do is think about how many other times this has happened that we don't know about. And maybe those judges weren't as fair as Susan was. These scandals undermine public confidence in the system. In the end, the Judicial Tenure Commission asked the Michigan Supreme Court to suspend Susan for 1 year without pay. Instead, they gave her 6 months. After that, she could return to the bench for the rest of her term, which she did. As she was an elected judge, she was allowed to run for re-election, but she opted not to. She ended up leaving the bench and going into private practice. But that didn't happen until after Susan had to testify during Mick's trial, which was held in June of 2000. A lot of what people read in the papers leading up to the trial never made it in front of the jury because a lot of it was erroneous, and it's really a good reminder about how reporting can influence a jury pool, and it's why I never cover cases pending trial anymore. The book, A Deadly Affair, which was a source for this episode, I mentioned it at the top. The author, Tom Henderson, did an amazing job examining the press around this case and that erroneous information put in the papers that set up a story that wasn't necessarily true. For instance, it was reported that Mick was about to get a large settlement, and Leann wanted half of it in the divorce. That would be a motive. It would answer the question, why kill her versus divorce her? But in the end, it turned out Mick's share of the settlement was so small that it wasn't even brought up at trial because the prosecutor admitted it was too insignificant to be a motive. Another thing reported was that Leann had bought the house with her own money and put Mick through law school, giving the impression that he took what he could from her and then cast her aside when he finished law school. But that wasn't true. They actually had to get help from family to even pay the earnest money when they bought the home, and the house was purchased with a mortgage. And as for law school, Mick used student loans to pay for it while he also worked. But probably the most sensational thing was an interview with one of Leann's friends where she said Mick was a Satanist and he played a violent video game with Leann where he would kill her. No one else in her life knew anything about the Satanism or the video game, and her family said it simply wasn't true. And beyond not being true, it was really upsetting to her family that false information was being reported because it muddied the waters. And it felt like these interviews with more sensational claims were really just about people using Leann's death for their own 15 minutes of attention. At trial, the only evidence of a motive produced had nothing to do with a large settlement or with Satanism. It had to do with Mick's relationship with Susan. He knew it would be over with her if she found out Leann was pregnant, and he would be trapped, unhappy, in this marriage that he felt bound to because of his child. So he hatched a plan to keep both his child and Susan in his life full time. The state made this seem like a bit of a long game. He reconciled with Leann and fawned over her just to lure her into a sense of security. He acted over the moon about a new baby in front of Leann and her parents to throw them off from what he really had planned. The plan was to shoot Leann and make it look like an accident, but Mick had to account for some things he knew about as a criminal defense attorney, like gunshot residue. He came up with this date to the gun range, so he had an easy excuse for any GSR found on his hands or his clothes, and it also gave him an excuse to have his gun out and around Leann, who was afraid of firearms. The state said what really happened was that Mick and Leann came home and had sex. He then shot her in the head while she was kneeling. The force pushed her back onto the bed before she slid to the floor. He then staged the scene, including washing his hands to get rid of the blowback from shooting his wife. and that accounted for the blood in the drain trap. Then he called 911. He gave the story that he had rehearsed to put it out there from the start that Leann had shot herself. The defense attacked each step of the state's case, starting with the timeline. The state said that they had made it home, had sex, and then Mick killed Leann and staged the scene. The detail about them having sex really fed into this narrative that Mick was about as cold-blooded as you can imagine. But the timeline was very tight for that to have happened unless this was the quickiest of all quickies. And the physical evidence that they had sex didn't exclude it having happened on a different day. They could have had sex up to 72 hours before based on the evidence. And Mick said they did have sex on the 14th, which was within this range. The defense also attacked the motive. Susan had stayed with Mick for over a year off and on and never broke things off because he was married. The only time they broke up was Mick's doing. He didn't worry that Susan would break up with him because she never had before. As for the forensic evidence, the defense accused the state of misinterpreting it, like the distance the shot was fired from. The testing done to determine how far away the shot was fired was done at the ranges of contact, 6 inches, 12, 18, 24, 30 inches. When fired at 6 inches or closer, soot was left behind that was not observed on Leann's body. At 12 inches and 18 inches, the stippling pattern matched and there was no soot. At 24 inches and greater, the stippling didn't match. But the defense asked the ME if they tested Leann's hair for soot, and the answer was no. So did they know there was no soot there, or did they just not find it because they didn't look that hard? The defense also asked detailed questions about the variables they accounted for in this experiment. Like, was the ME sure they used the same gunpowder in the test as was in the bullet that killed Leann? And how would that affect the stippling? The ME didn't know. The defense did have a second autopsy done by Werner Spitz, who was an ME in Michigan at the time. And he did not rule that the bullet wound was self-inflicted, but he said it could not be ruled out. His determination was that the manner of death was undetermined. However, the defense opted not to call Dr. Spitz to the stand, because his reputation as a leading expert was starting to evolve to him being called a hired gun for wealthy defendants. So they chose to focus on other experts who could refute the evidence, like the blood mist on Mick's shirt cuff. The defense initially wanted to get that evidence thrown out, but then they dropped their motion when the DNA on the shirt came back. According to the lab, they could determine that this was human blood, but they could not match the DNA to Leann because there was far too little to test. This bloody scene with blowback hitting the mirror near the bed ended up misting just one spot on Mick's shirt in such a small amount that they couldn't even get DNA from it. The lack of blood actually supported the defense that Mick wasn't near Leann when she was shot. And their expert was allowed to examine the shirt, which he did, and he found zero blood evidence on it, even after it was pointed out to him where the state had found the microscopic blood. His testimony wasn't that it was too small of a sample. He doubted that the blood was even there. This expert also tore apart the state's theory of the case, saying it was impossible. You know, there's a lot of physics in crime scenes, and here it's going to come up again. The state said the force of the shot pushed Leann back onto the bed, and then she fell to the floor. As the defense expert testified, that only happens in Hollywood and not in real life. He cited the case of Bud Dwyer, who's a politician who killed himself on live television with a powerful gun. He didn't fly backwards. He just dropped. And that's what happens because there is a low transfer of energy. The defense expert's theory was that Leann was sitting on the bed, holding the gun, likely with her thumb in the trigger guard area and her fingers around the grip. As she leaned over to pick up a cartridge that had dropped, She put her hand on her leg, and the shifting movement caused her to accidentally pull the trigger. Under this scenario, the distance of the shot was consistent, as was the horizontal trajectory of the bullet, and it was consistent with the rest of the blood evidence. It's just not clear to me why she would have been holding the gun at all. You do not need to hold a gun to load a magazine. But the defense believed that the entire investigation and trial was just tunnel vision, with all of the evidence being interpreted in the way that confirmed Mick's guilt. Under the advice of his attorney, Mick did not take the stand. The jury then deliberated on 2 of the charges. The charge related to the assault of a pregnant individual had to be dismissed when the ME testified that Leann didn't undergo a stillbirth or a miscarriage, as those terms are medically understood, and that's due to how very early this pregnancy was. Because one of the firearm charges was linked to that charge, it was also dismissed. So the jury deliberated over the murder charge and 1 count of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and they were allowed to consider either first-degree murder or second-degree. The jury took 22 hours going over the evidence. That is a long time, excruciatingly long, while waiting on a verdict. You don't usually know what the jury's talking about specifically, what they're getting hung up on, and which way they're leaning. But we did get a little peek into this one. Partway through the deliberations, the jury asked for clarification on the jury instructions. They wanted to know if they could find Mick guilty if they simply found that Leann didn't shoot herself. Was that enough to hang a conviction on? The judge told them to just refer back to the instructions that they had already been given, and the state took this question as a promising sign that they would get a conviction. There was 0 evidence anyone else had been in the house. Mick made no comment about hearing anyone running out of the house after the shot was fired, and he was in the bathroom down the hall where he likely would have heard or seen something. So if the jury deduced that there were only 2 people in the house and they ruled out Leann as the shooter, that only left them with Mick. Later, when the jury talked openly about their deliberations, they disclosed that it only took about 15 minutes for them to determine that Leann did not take her own life on purpose. But they were split 8 in favor of a conviction and 4 in favor of an acquittal. When they all finally agreed that Mick had fired the shot, they then had to decide on premeditation. So it was only after 22 hours of deliberation over 4 days that they had their verdict. They found Mick guilty of second-degree murder and the firearms charge. They had their own theory of the crime. Mick didn't plan ahead to kill Leann like the state said, but saw the opportunity and took it. Then, when Leann started bleeding, reality set in, and he freaked out, accounting for Mick's hysterical 911 call. Mick held in his emotion at the reading of the verdict, but his mother and Leann's parents did not. They were all crying. At sentencing, many people spoke, from Leann's mother to her sisters to her clients from the nail salon. The person who did not speak was Mick. The judge then told Mick that the jury didn't believe him, and neither did she. The sentencing guidelines would indicate a sentence of 13 to 22 years, but noting the callous nature of the murder, the judge sentenced Mick Fletcher to life in prison. He would first be eligible for parole in 2017. In August, after the conviction, Mick's parental rights were terminated, and his daughter was later adopted by Leann's family. 4 months after the verdict, 2020 Downtown aired an episode on the case. They had 10 of the 12 jurors present to be interviewed and to discuss how they got to their verdict. And what they said makes me a little uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. Some of the jurors pointed to issues with the 911 call. One said everyone was bothered by it, feeling like Mick wasn't sincere, and noted that he never used Leann's name in the call. He called her honey and sweetheart, and to the dispatcher, he referred to her as my wife, which seems to me like a really odd thing to be hung up on when they had no other speech references of how Mick normally spoke to and about Leann, and there was no evidence presented to them about the linguistics behind this. Juries doing their own linguistical analysis seems outside of their scope to me. The jurors also said they thought the story Mick told the 911 dispatcher was just too detailed and sounded rehearsed, with all the details he gave about where their daughter was and how they just got back from the gun range. He seemed like he was trying to establish a story very quickly. But I read the transcript of the 911 call in the book, A Deadly Affair, and almost everything Mick said was an answer to a question he was asked. He didn't just go on the call and rattle off his story. He mentioned his daughter was not home after being asked if anyone else was there. He mentioned being at the fire range only after the dispatcher asked if they had been arguing before the shooting. He said no, and he started talking about what they had been doing. In context, the answer made sense. The jurors also said that after hours of discussion, they had one holdout juror who was just not convinced. So they decided to reenact the crime scene as described in testimony using the actual gun that was entered into evidence and the measurements that had been presented to them. During this reenactment, they noticed the gun landed differently than how it had at the crime scene. They repeated it 5 times, and every time it landed somewhere other than where it had been found. That was one factor of a few that led the jurors to conclude that Leann did not shoot herself, and the gun was placed by her body. And if she did not shoot herself, there was only one other option, and that was Mick. But they weren't convinced that he acted with premeditation. The trip to the gun range did make it seem possibly planned, but that just wasn't enough evidence. So after this 2020 episode aired, it gave Mick's appellate attorney more points to include in the direct appeal. They argued that the non-scientific reenactment was not appropriate. But the appellate court said that it didn't cross the line, and Mick's appeal was denied. He remains, as of this recording, in prison. Mick, in a written interview with Tom Henderson, the author of A Deadly Affair, gave his own theory on what he thinks happened. He thinks that Leann didn't want to load the bullets into the magazine, possibly because she didn't want to break a nail. She was a nail tech after all. So instead of loading the clip, she put it with the gun on the dresser. He hadn't told her that he had reloaded the gun while she was in the bathroom, and she might have thought it was empty since they had just shot it and the second magazine was outside of the gun. So she reached over and grabbed the gun with her thumb on the trigger and her other fingers on the grip, and that's when it went off. Now, Tom Henderson extensively researched the case for his book, and he had access to interviews with both families and several people involved in the case. He got into this so much deeper than I could possibly do here, so I highly recommend going and reading the book. In the acknowledgments, he apologized to Leann's family. They had opened up to him, and he wrote that they probably expected the book to go a different way. In the end, he just wasn't convinced of Mick's guilt, and he realized that Leann's family may feel some betrayal at that. And I know that feeling. I once covered a case for a different podcast I had years ago, and the family member I worked with was not happy with the final episode I put out. There were some things that I learned through the documents, relevant things, that didn't fully align with what this family member believed happened. It's truly an awful feeling to know that you may have compounded or complicated someone's grief through your reporting. Because at the end of the day, nothing in those documents that we're going through ever changes the fact that these families are grieving. And I hope that the empathy with which Tom Henderson told the story in his book, which again, I highly recommend people read, is felt by the family and that they do have peace with it. As for me, I'm not convinced of Mick's innocence, but I'm not sure the state proved their case, and I am not a fan of how the jury came to their decision. But those 12 people disagreed with me, and those 12 people's votes are the only ones that count. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.